Hey there. Welcome to the Pelvis Project podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Roxy. We're two pelvic health experts brought together by passion for our careers, entrepreneurship, motherhood, and the desire for intentional relationships.
Join us in our mission to spread pelvic floor awareness and start conversations surrounding the truth behind genuine health, imperfect wellness, and joyfully navigating life. We are so glad you are here with us.
Let's start the conversation. Welcome back.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. We are recording on a Sunday afternoon and not at 9 o'clock at night. So this is good.
It's already off to a great start just by being in the daylight.
That's right.
Well, we are back, and today we are going to talk about the menstrual cycle. And that that word in general can make some people cringe and kind of like, it's just not like a fun time in life for some people. But hopefully we're going to maybe give a renewed perspective on it and just the value of it. And I don't know, maybe we can make you look forward to it the next time it's your time. I don't know.
Yeah. Because I mean, we've been talking about our fertility work that we've been doing, and this is kind of a continuation of our last couple of episodes where we do need to tie together like why we are going to be talking to you about your cycle and why we're going to be asking you to track if you don't track, and what are the things that we're going to be looking for. And it really is important, regardless on if you are in a fertility journey. Every woman should be tracking their cycles because it gives so much information into what your body is doing. Just like we do breast exams and we should be doing like vulvar exams, we need to be tracking our cycle, especially, well, I wouldn't even say especially, I'd say at all periods of our life, all seasons, we should. And when we start getting into the perimenopausal, menopausal phases of our life, that is so telling, which it's good to know. And normally in school, when we're taught about our periods, we are taught basically nothing, just that you're going to bleed. And there's no mention of menopause or perimenopause or anything like that. So we're going to talk and dive into that. But before we get started, Roxy, tell us something good this week. What's been going on?
Well, last podcast, I was solo. Austin was in Africa,
That's right.
And he is back, and we are
right.
Life feels normal again. So that is my something good. We are back, and man, people whose like husbands travel or are in the military or single moms or I guess single parents in general, hats off to y'all because it was fine. We did good. I'm glad this little tiny time was over, but yeah, I just am thinking, man, it made it so much sweeter when he was home and we were doing bath time together, or you know what I mean? Not us two together, but help with with the girls together, or just like having another set of hands. I love him more than just how helpful he is, but yeah, it just felt complete. We just feel complete in our house right now. So
absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, it sure does. What about you, Megan? What's something good? Tell me something good.
Okay, my something good. Let's see. So we are just coming off of last weekend. My husband and I, for goodness, it's been like 6 or 7, I think 7 of our church does a marriage retreat every year. And so that was last weekend, and we look forward to it every year. Just time to get away and learn and have one-on-one time. And so we had that last weekend, and it was so great and just fun. And it's been fun to see each time, like what we take away from it and how much we've grown in different areas. And so that was nice. And we got back and just kind of went right back into family time, which normally I like to have like a slow introduction into that. And I'm always kind of bummed, but it was like it was just so much fun. And then went right into, my son had a full day of baseball that we weren't expecting, but that was just really great to experience. It was so hot, but fun. And my dad and my father-in-law were there, and we all just kind of figured out how to stay cool. And I don't know, it was just so good. So that my husband and I just today said, was that just last weekend? Because it seems like forever ago, but Yeah. And then I obviously there's like lots of good things that are just silly. Like today, I'm like organizing my medicine cabinet and I'm just so grateful to have some time to kind of get back to my home life because business ownership is, taken over things for quite a while. So it's just kind of nice. And we went to the pool yesterday and then we came home. We went and ran some errands and got fireworks and it's just nice. I took a nap. I slept yesterday. Oh my gosh. I slept in until like 10:30. I didn't get out of bed until 11. My kids are like, "Mommy, what is the matter?" And I'm like, it's like I'm in high
Needed
school
it.
again. I did. It was so great. And I took a nap later. So anyway, that was a lot,
You
but
should be ready to go then right now.
I
Like
know. Well, I was really ready to go yesterday and then I stayed up a little too late and then I got up this morning for church. I was like, so I just sabotaged. That's okay. I'm feeling
or your
good.
body was prepping for it. I mean, you
Yes.
saw how you look in it at
Yes.
it.
My aura ring has been very happy with me. It's like, go get him, tiger.
That's funny.
So, anyway, okay. Well, let's talk about menstrual health and tracking and all that good stuff. So, we have like an average of like 400 periods in our lifetime. And we basically need to be able to not dread them. And we want to be able to just enjoy them, if you will. I don't know what the better way. I look at it as, I mean, I tell my patients too, every time I start my cycle, I'm like, yes, all right, body. Like, I'm so proud of it and to have consistency because I've tracked for so long that now when I have these weird things happen, like I have personally just recently, it's so enlightened. It like shows so much about what's going on somewhere else. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just am thinking like, man, 400 is a big number. And I just think about when we'll get into this, but just if if your cycle is awful, if it's debilitating, that number is that probably feels
Yeah.
even bigger, and
Mhm.
I don't know, I think that just really brings a lot of what we've learned and what we're hopefully going to share. I don't know, I just feel like it brings it full circle of like it's inevitable. I mean, that you can get on, medication to stop it or whatever, like there's different things we can
Yeah.
do to like manage or whatever. And we can talk more about that. But man, it's like, this is inevitable. So it's one of those things where it's like, we know it's going to happen. Like,
Yeah.
let's just kind of figure it out. It almost just gives a boost, a new perspective that I wish I would have had earlier in life, or
Oh,
that I wish like
absolutely.
when it was starting, instead of at school, then being like, here's what happens. Da, da, da. But like to make it almost like, isn't our body amazing? Like, this is
Yes.
what is going to happen. You're going to experience it. I don't know. I just think that, man, there's low hanging fruit. There's a lot of opportunity here to say, wow, this is
Yeah.
incredible. Instead
Yeah.
of, oh gosh, here it comes.
Yeah. Well, even, you think back of like, okay, so let's like, if we're just talking about like cervical mucus, like discharge, if you will. I remember when I was growing up and I was younger and I would go to my appointment and I would say something with my guy, my OBGYN, she was great, but I felt like I had like too much or not enough. And, or, like it
Mhm.
was bothersome. And I'd bring it up and she's like, yep, someone had a lot. Lucky you. But nobody told me, hey, that actually, you're supposed to follow that because the change in that cervical mucus you see a change happen with your cycle and what the purpose was for it. I had no clue. And that alone, if you're listening and you have adolescent girls that are going to be starting their period, have that conversation with them. And if you are unsure about that, do some education, learn about cervical mucus, learn about those changes so that then they recognize that it's not gross, like their body isn't gross. It's like a really cool thing that our body does. And there's a purpose behind it. So just stuff like that. I mean, it's not talked about. And like we mentioned, our cycle is our fifth vital sign. So when it comes to fertility, and we're tying it back in with that, with everything that we've been learning, we need to be paying close attention. So let's talk first, Roxy. Why don't you tell us about like kind of what the norms are for a period, and then we can go from there.
So a normal period, the frequency is supposed to be about every 24 to 38 days. Now in the fertility world, we're going to shoot for closest to try to like 28, like kind of right in the middle of that. But really, if you're tracking and
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of things that go into that of we're not all the exact same, but
Yeah.
just if you hear 28 days and then you're like, wait, 24 to 38, that's a big difference. I think there's just room for deviation. All of our bodies are different. So just kind of know those are the numbers we kind of shoot for.
If you're consistent, and that's if you're tracking and you're always like 31, 31, 31, then that's your
Yeah.
consistent.
Yeah. And there's going to be mild inconsistencies. Irregularity, we shouldn't see any greater than like 7 to 9 days difference between like the shortest and the longest cycles. And so you might be 28 days and then 27 and then maybe 29 or whatever. Like you just know that
Mm-hmm.
there's room for error, and that's still very healthy. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. And some people might be like, okay, move on. And some people might think, oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
So just recognize that the women that you're surrounding yourself with, you're brushing shoulders with, there might be a huge deviation if you guys started to really sit down and look at everybody's differences. So anyway, we just appreciate that there's differences between everybody, but the duration too. And I think this is interesting it shouldn't be any longer than 8 days. And the cycle, the bleeding
Or I'm
portion.
sorry, the bleeding.
Yeah. The bleeding portion should not be longer than 8 days of flow. And so, that also might be news to people. And also, not that anyone's probably measuring, but if you're like, wowza, I'm a lot longer than that, or you think you're heavy or you think you're light, there has been studies that has measured the amount, and it's supposed to be less than 80 mils. And so sometimes if you use like a Diva cup or something, like you can kind of probably guess, you could probably start measuring if you wanted to, but we can really get hung up on the volume, but really we should look at like the quality of life that you're living. And so if it's so heavy that it's unmanageable for you and you're not able to do the things that you want to, then that's too heavy. And if
Mm-hmm.
it's heavier than one of your girlfriends or whatever, but you're like thinking I can manage, like it's not a problem, then that also might be okay. So
Yeah. It's just good to track because you want to know changes. And also, let's just say here, so we don't have any confusion. Day one of bleeding is day one of your cycle. And so then that continues day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way. And let's say you're on day 28, and then the next day you start your period, it's day one again, which means your cycle is 28 days. And so when we say, how long is your cycle? That means the whole length from period to then you're going to start your period again. So it's not just how many days did you bleed. That's what we want to know. Like, what day are you in your cycle? Sometimes I'll have women say like, oh, I quit bleeding 5 days ago. Because for us, if we're doing manual work, visceral work, and you just ovulated and you're actively trying to conceive, we want to know what day you're on. And we want to know, did you have intercourse? Because if implantation has been an issue for you, we are not going to sit there and mobilize your uterus if we're waiting to find out, are we in the 2-week wait, or if you've had a transfer or something like that. So that's why we want to know where you're at in your cycle. And that's why you should know too, where you're at in your cycle. That's what we mean by that. So day one is day one of bleeding. And then you just continue to count up until you start your period again. So,
sure. And I think we're going to jump into some tracking type things, but I know that this is a great place to start. If you're just like, oh, I'm all over the place, I'm not really paying attention to it. Like, just start tracking what date your cycle starts. Like that's the beginning, and then we can expand from there.
And there's also for people that this feels overwhelming, there are different methods to track, and there are people that are out there that's what they do is they teach you how to track. No, we have a girl here locally. Her handle is Serial Healers. But there's also like Creighton method, natural family planning, that sort of thing, FAM method. All of those are really great places to start so that you can learn how to not just like, it's okay, when did my cycle start? And we're also going to look at cervical mucus. We're going to look at temperature, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But there are, we are going to have you come in. I know the way that we treat, and we have a whole list of questions that we will ask regarding your menstrual cycle. But if you're really wanting to get in and learn your cycle, there's definitely some providers that are outside of like PT or OT that's what they do, which is really cool. So, okay. So some common causes for irregular periods, let's just touch on those. And that could be things like PCOS, thyroid disease, like high prolactin if you're breastfeeding, hypothalamic amenorrhea, premature ovarian insufficiency, breastfeeding, recent stoppage of oral contraceptives, or any sort of anatomical issues such as like cervical stenosis, uterine scarring, stuff like that. So those could be all things that could cause some sort of irregular periods, but also, oh my goodness, we could dive into stress, travel, caloric deficit.
Yeah, I would say nutrition or like activity
Yes.
level, whether it's
Yes.
lack of nutrition or lack of nutrition because you're really, really, really active.
Yes. And that's one thing to think about is like with caloric restriction, we've touched on this with nutrition when it comes to the reproductive system. But if you are like, if you're in a caloric deficit and your body doesn't have enough energy, your brain's going to shut down that reproductive system because it doesn't have the energy to do that. So again, that's that fifth vital sign. It's going to want to keep you alive. It's going to want to use your energy for things like keeping your heart going, not conceiving a child. So keeping that stuff in mind is super important, again, of us just trying to help our body feel safe. Again, it is pretty crazy how travel and stress can affect cycles. And I just myself have gone through this for like the past 3 cycles. I traveled and then I had a lot of stress, and boy, howdy, is all over the place. And I have thyroid dysfunction. So it's something that I have to keep my eye on. And it definitely can be a player. But it also leads us into REDS, which is the relative energy deficiency in sport, which we have to think about it as well. So, which could be a whole other episode, but there we go.
Well, and I think just to jump in, just to kind of add, like not add to, but thinking about like depending on the season. So obviously we're looking at this in a fertility season, but I mean, man, Megan, going back to like you said, like if you're not understanding this or you've never thought of it this way, or you have a daughter, I just think, man, thinking about the importance of whenever you or your child is in that fertility space and window of like, man, I want to have a baby now. It's like there's so much that you can be doing earlier in your life to even just set that up to be healthy, to have those regular rhythms, to know your body, all the things. And so the whole cycle, for me, it wasn't super important until all of a sudden I was like wanting to be pregnant, and so then I'm like, oh, shoot, I need to really like kind of zone in on this. And I think, man, we're just missing a big piece of that ahead of time, where it's an inconvenience until we want to know what's going on. And then after that, it's an inconvenience again. And so anyway, just thinking through like diet, nutrition, and especially our active, like I think about middle school and high school, even college athletes, of just just are we resting well? Are we fueling our body in those like more formative years? Not formative as in like developmentally, but for just the fertility formative years of adolescence there, and how important that can be.
Yeah. And I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of getting passionate about this kind of time period with this adolescence, because my daughter's about to turn 13, and she herself has been going through just being really fatigued and tired. And, I'm doing all the thing and checking all the boxes and getting blood work done and that sort of thing just to make sure. But just knowing and being aware of what is happening to their bodies, to know when to push and know when not to push. And if I wasn't aware of the changes that are actually hormonally happening and what could happen if I were to push too hard for her, or not protect her sleep and not protect her activity level, what that can do. And it's been fascinating. And maybe we'll talk more about that on another episode of just this like adolescent time and what I'm learning. But I know at her age, I did not know any of this stuff. And so it has just been an interesting time, because I feel like, when you first have you have a newborn and it's like all new. And although it's easier in a sense, this is my first time having an adolescent.
Okay. Let's dive into let's just talk through the cycle here. And yeah, the full cycle. So this would be like Megan said earlier, from day 1 is when your bleeding starts, and then clear through all the way until basically the day before your bleeding starts again. That's going to be your cycle. And so we're just going to talk through that and make sense of what's happening in our body during all that process.
Yeah. So we have what's called the HPO axis, which we mentioned in our last episode, I believe, but that's the hypothalamic pituitary ovary kind of system. And then we also are talking about the uterus with this too, because we're talking about menstruation. So it really kind of starts from the hypothalamus, and we get this gonadotropin releasing hormone. It pulses and from the hypothalamus, and that stimulates the pituitary to release what's called FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. So this is going to help that follicle that is your ovary has. It's going to stimulate, and you're going to have a mature follicle, and this is going to grow, and that produces, your follicle is producing estrogen.
FYI, follicle is going to equal egg. In case like that just is a new term or an uncertain term. Yeah, our ovary produces what's called follicles. There's a lot of them in there, and one will dominate, and then it will become, when it's released, that's an egg. So when Megan says follicle, think egg.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Yes. So anyway, this follicle is releasing, helping produce estrogen, and this helps kind of prep the endometrium. And then right before ovulation, the pituitary releases a surge of what's called LH, which is luteinizing hormone. And that is what triggers us to have ovulation. And that's what releases this, the egg releases. And then the breakdown of what's called the corpus luteum is what makes progesterone. So as you can see, that's why ovulation and that whole system right there is important, because our estrogen or our progesterone, if we don't have that ovulation happening, or if we don't have enough progesterone, then estrogen is going to dominate, that sort of thing, which I think is just so cool. Because as somebody that's 40 and is like probably in perimenopause, like learning, okay, this is why you have hormone changes, and ovulation gets kind of funky and you might not ovulate, and then you do ovulate. And that's why, hello, at this age is when you have an increased risk for twins. I say risk like it's a problem.
Prevalence.
Because your ovulation gets kind of just inconsistent, and you can have release 2 eggs. And anyway, it's just cool, because you're like, once you realize how ovulation is so important. So anyway, you can actually still menstruate without ovulation. That's important to know. And so that's what's happening. And so in the cycle, you kind of have this estrogen starts to lower at the beginning of your cycle, it starts to rise, and then we have a drop kind of right around ovulation. And then it does pick up again in the later half of your cycle. And then progesterone, same thing, it stays low. And then after ovulation, it picks up again, because that's where that corpus luteum breakdown is happening. And again, it's like a symphony when you see all the hormones and how they rise and fall. And when it comes to fertility work and what we're doing, if you're seeing us for fertility optimization or, natural conception, is we want to know that ovulation is happening, because we're not just going to be like, okay, I can do all this visceral mobilization and all this abdominal work, which is helpful in its own sense in other areas. But for the purpose of helping you conceive, if you're not ovulating, let's be clear here, it doesn't matter how much of that I'm doing, it's not going to work. And so I think that's something to understand, is that's why we're going to push to make sure that we have labs, and we're going to push to make sure that we're tracking your menstrual cycle, we're tracking cervical mucus, we're having you see if we're having this LH spike, because, which you can have that too with PCOS and things, not actually be doing what we think. So in a roundabout way, that's why we want to know this stuff.
Even just I think from a common outsider view of females get a bad rap for being hormonal. I just think about, as Megan was talking about, the like ebbs and flows and the spikes and the dips and the drops just throughout our cycle, of just even appreciating and saying, oh goodness, okay. Like, yes, this is actually, I'm not saying to be crazy is healthy, right? But like, to just feel like those emotion changes is very healthy. I mean, if you look at all the different symptoms of the cycle, there's emotional symptoms, of just even like overly critical inward energy, or, like confusion or sensitivity to criticism, and that is actually like, obviously, as we grow and we learn to kind of regulate that, it's healthier. But to have those in symptoms in general actually is indication that our body is going through those ebbs and flows like it needs to be. I just think it takes us a little bit, a hormonal teenager is really, their body's really trying to figure out what's going on because it's never experienced that. Where then as we get older, we learn to kind of roll with those ebbs and flows a little bit. Our body can adjust. It can be a little more resilient during those highs and lows. But I just think about like really on the outside, it's like, oh, hormonal teenager, or wow, she must be starting her period. I don't know how many times in high school it's like, oh goodness, she must be close, or da 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 da. It's like a kind of a negative thing. But I just think really when we look at it anatomically, it is kind of beautiful of like, oh, but that's what's supposed to be happening. And poor girl, like I just look back at my previous self and said, oh, my body just had never experienced that before. And I was being overly critical of myself because I was struggling and emotions came out of nowhere. And, and I wasn't normally like that beforehand, but of course that's going to happen. So anyway, just maybe some self-care or maybe some grace that needs to be extended to ourselves or people around us of just saying, oh, really, when we look at it, it's actually, that's how it's kind of supposed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And just knowing that, so, you start your period, and then we have this, what's called the follicular phase, and then we have ovulation, and then we have what's called the luteal phase or luteal phase. And one of our instructors for our fertility certification course that talked to us about tracking and menstruation had such a beautiful kind of thought process and picture of kind of the seasons of our body, just like within our cycle of like winter to spring to summer to autumn, like this whole thing. And it really is kind of neat to think about our bodies in that way. But I think, yes, I mean, our biggest thing is just learning. Okay, so if you started day one and you haven't ovulated yet, you're in this follicular phase. And then after ovulation, you're in this luteal phase. And even just learning that can be one of the first steps to knowing kind of like where you're at with your cycle. So an analogy that goodness, we love Michelle Lyons, but analogy that she had used that I heard her say is estrogen is like our fertilizer and progesterone is like the lawnmower. And so of our uterine lining, so if we don't have that progesterone to keep the estrogen in check, the uterine lining is not going to be thinned or shed.
Sloughed, yeah.
Sloughed, yes. So we can end up having heavier, more painful periods. And remember, the uterus is a muscle and it has to contract hard to be able to slough that uterine lining. And there can be reasons why we're starting to have more painful periods. Again, especially as we get older and this suddenly our periods are changing, is because if we're not having the ovulation happen and we're not having our progesterone rise, then therefore that's that lawnmower. It's not keeping everything in check, and we're going to potentially have heavier or more painful periods. The other thing to remember, and this might be good because people always wonder why they get period poops. Everybody wants to know why they have diarrhea around their period. So there is a natural chemical that's produced in the endometrial tissue. It's prostaglandins, and there's a specific one. But this is produced when we have like ischemia necrosis, which is you're going to have your period. So this can cause more intense contractions of the myometrium because we want to move that menstrual fluid, and it could cause increased pain, inflammation. But this also increases the mobility of the intestines. And so that can cause you to have those loose stools, diarrhea, that sort of thing. One thing that can happen when we are doing manual work and working on mobilizing the uterus is sometimes people will report if they're getting ready to have their cycle or they start a few days later, if we've been mobilizing the uterus, it gets those prostaglandins, it can get them going. And so they end up having kind of a more heavier, painful period. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if we're trying to get that lining to slough. But it's just so fascinating. Isn't that it's just cool. Who knew about these prostaglandins?
Yeah. Yeah. I just had a patient, I think it was last week, that came in and she was like, you know how last time I was in here, I was late for my period and we had work. She's like, I started it right after I left here. And so it just was kind of funny of just like, and who knows, she could have, I mean, hindsight, if she was like kind of late or whatever, then she could have just been gonna start anyway. But yeah, it was just definitely thinking through this anatomy of, if we can even just stimulate that area to contract and to kind of be moving a little bit more, then it is, there can be some
increased blood flow, increased prostaglandins, get that sucker to go. Especially, I mean, we do not want this. We don't want there to be a thickening in the uterine lining and just sit there over time. Like that can increase risk for many things. So it's just another reason why it's important for us to track and keep our eye on stuff so that if we are noticing changes, we can get our hormones checked and see what we need to do and if there needs to be any supplementation anywhere. Okay, so to wrap things up here, let's just say, well, one more thing before we go on this. There is another reason too that we need to be keeping our eye. We know we can have amenorrhea, which is no period for more than 3 to 6 months if you're, a regular menstruator and then it's stopped. And we need to figure out why. And then dysmenorrhea is painful periods. And this is when increase in estrogen, if estrogen's not kept in track, this can be one of the causes of that thickening uterine lining. And then again, if we pull it back to prostaglandins that are released and you get increased pain and that can affect the bowels. And so we need to be able to investigate those things and figure out what's going on. We know that endometriosis goes undiagnosed for years. And one of the biggest indicators is painful heavy periods. So, but to wrap this up, Roxy, okay, so biggest takeaway is know that when you start your period, that is when you start bleeding, that's day one. Okay. Know that your cervical mucus is there for a reason and it is telling you and when you are going to peak into ovulation and when you're out of that fertile window. Know that cervical mucus is there for a reason. And I would encourage you to find somebody to help learn more about that. We have the luteal phase. We have the follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. That's something good to remember. Roxy, got anything else?
I think you summed it up well. I think appreciating, I just would challenge us all to appreciate that just we give ourselves kind of grace and compassion and look at how beautiful our body is and that it's functioning well, or maybe, appreciate, oh, wow, that's really amazing that my body's telling me that something's wrong. And I want to be curious about that and pursue that more instead of just suffer this symptom that's actually a symptom of probably something bigger than just my body sucks at menstruating or whatever,
Yeah. Knowing that it's the fifth vital sign might trump all of that. Just knowing that it really is important and us paying attention and listening to our body. So, all right. Well, hopefully you learned something about your menstrual cycle on this episode. And our next episode, we're going to kind of wrap it up with our fertility certification training that we did of how kind of like all of this, and then also talking about the hands-on treatment that we do and then how it all kind of goes together. So
let's keep the conversation going.
All right. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Pelvis Project podcast. Help us continue the conversation by liking and sharing this episode with friends. And if you really want to do us a solid, leave us a review. If you'd like to follow us on social, check out the show notes for links. And remember, this week, take a deep breath and relax your pelvic floor.